Well, if there's one relationship, to use the cliche, that has withstood the test of time, it has been the one between India and the United Kingdom. Joining us on Left, Right and Centre tonight is the outgoing High Commissioner to India, Sir Dominic Asquith. Sir Dominic Asquith, thank you very much for being with us today.
Pleasure.
You're leaving India after 4 years. So if you had to sum up where you see the India-UK relationship today, what would that be?
I would focus certainly on the investment angle, where the balance is very even between the two countries. Our companies, British companies, have a proud and long history of investing here in very large amounts of money too. Just to pluck three, I mean, Vodafone since 2007 have put in over 20 billion into India. BP since 2011 has put in 10 billion, another 2 or 3 committed. And BT on the telecom sector has their biggest institution facility outside the UK, sitting just south in Gurgaon. So there's a real interest, lasting interest. There's just 3 of those companies, and vice versa. Indian companies in the UK, over about 850 of them. They've doubled their revenues in the last 4 years. So that sort of balance of investment interests is one that in many cases underpins the relevance of the two countries to each other. There's a phrase that Prime Minister Modi used, which is living bridge, which I pinched, rather unfairly in a sense, and we have worked with very hard over the 4 years. And what's it mean? Well, it means both those words. Living, it's relevant to the two countries. Bridge, it's the way that ideas, people, institutions go back and forth, and it covers a huge spectrum. So if there's one thing that I would feel that would tinge with a bit of happiness, the sadness that I inevitably feel leaving the country, is if that bridge is strengthened, which I think it is, then I'm grateful for that. And I certainly want to tread that bridge coming the other way at some point.
Do you think, though, that the investment potential has been fully realized? And what would you say would still be the difficulties that remain as far as doing business in India are concerned? I mean, you gave the example of Vodafone, and we've seen, what happened with that also. So what would you like to see further change in India?
British businesses are in India for the long haul. It's not a short-term investment. And you think of some of them like BAE, Rolls-Royce. They've been here 40, 50, 60 years in one guise or another. JCB for 40 years. So they are committed for the long term. What they, and all other businesses, foreign businesses investing, would like to see is more ease in doing business, what Prime Minister Modi is extremely focused on, and India has raised itself up that World Bank League table.
What are the hurdles that still remain? I mean, in terms of that,
there's a variety of hurdles. I mean, you talk to Indian business, you know well that they face too. There is understandably quite a lot of regulatory hurdles that exist still. So the ease of doing business is exactly that, making it easier to do business. But there's a lot of progress that has been made in terms of easing up the way that companies can come in, the terms under which they can make their foreign investment.
So progress, but still some way to go.
Like all things, you can't be complacent about where you've reached at any time. You've got to have the ambition to do better. And the potential to do better is enormous here. If you look at how the economy has grown in the past decade and is due to grow, it's going through a little bit of a
Does that concern you, the Indian economic slump? And
all economies will go through a bit of a turbulence at one time or another. British economy, European economies are going.
You see this as a temporary sort of a slump at the moment? I
wouldn't call it a slump. It may be a slower down of the economy, but temporary, yes, of course it is.
We're also speaking at a time historic, transformations are taking place in your country. Brexit is on the anvil. And, one wonders what would happen to an India-UK free trade agreement coming from here. Do you think it will still take some time until the UK sort of finds its feet post-Brexit, gets all its things sorted out vis-a-vis Europe first? How long do you think it would take for a free trade agreement to actually, for even discussions to start? Because Piyush Goyal did indicate recently that India is very keen to go ahead with that.
So a free trade agreement may be the end product. When you get there, how you get there, what the shape will be, uncertain. So what we set ourselves way back in January 2018 was to focus on some of those areas in the trade and investment side of increasing market access. What we then developed in the summer last year, when Mr. Goyal was in London, was to create what we call building blocks, where you would look at sectors, whether there was goods or services, where you could develop in a context, and this is important to take into account, in a context where the UK was not at that point free to negotiate separate trade agreements, to build those blocks incrementally to a point where at each stage you were improving the trading arrangements, the investment arrangements for both countries. So that's the direction of travel. Putting the flesh on the bones is what we're going to be engaged on. You will see after tomorrow, when we formally withdraw from the EU, there will then be that implementation period, which will run to the end of the year, December the 31st. You have seen to some extent already, but you'll see a lot more new energy going into the new economic opportunities, but also the historic ties that exist between the UK and countries outside the EU and India par excellence.
As far as Brexit is concerned, the other concern I think in India is the fact that Brexit is seen as anti-immigration. And how would you then sort of address Indian concerns on that? I mean, will Indians, ordinary Indians who seek to migrate, immigrate, or just go and live and work and study in the UK, will they still be able to do that the way they used to?
Very much so. I don't actually recognise that sort of anti-immigrant stuff that is attached to the Brexit. If you look at the time that I've been here, at the various figures for visitors, so visas that we issue, they're superlative. Students, Indian students who have come to the UK over those 4 years have almost trebled in numbers 3 times. The number of visas we give to Indian business people is more than the total number of visas we give to business people around the world. So more than 50% go to Indians.
But immigration, will that become tougher?
Well, look at the stuff that's been coming out. Last year, we announced that we would go back to the 2-year post-study visa for students as of the coming academic year. Earlier this week, again, a fast-track mechanism for researchers, scientists, mathematicians, and so on, strengths, I have to say, of the Indian society. And very much a focus from the government, British government at the moment, of attracting the talent that the British economy needs. That talent happens to be in rich supply here in India. So I'm really optimistic.
Was last year, if I had to ask you very honestly, a little difficult for the India-UK relationship, particularly after India's actions in Jammu and Kashmir? And, we saw that I think the Indian government seemed to think that the UK was a bit hesitant in fully supporting India on what it had done. Was that a bit of a tricky time?
Not really. So let's sort of disentangle some of the content of that question. When it comes to Kashmir, nothing has changed. Nothing changed in the summer. Nothing has changed since then in terms of what the British government's policy has been on Kashmir, that it's an issue to be sorted out between India and Pakistan, taking into account the views and wishes of the Kashmiri people. So that still remains absolutely rock solid. In the case of Article 370, the Indian government made quite clear that the purpose of that was to improve the economic, developmental, security, political conditions that applied in Kashmir. So that's what we are all focused on and looking at. And in my conversations with the Indian government, they are very clearly committed to doing that. So we'll look at that. And in terms of managing it on the sort of international stage, there is nothing that has changed. So perceptions sometimes creep in, misperceptions, I would put it. But in terms of actual policy, Nothing has changed.
So you felt it was a misperception because the Indian government was obviously very irked, for example, with the fact that protesters were able to come outside the Indian High Commission in London. There was some violence as well. Windows were broken, etc. How did you sort of handle that?
Well, I want to be absolutely clear, both on behalf of my government and personally, me, that we deeply regret any threat that any diplomat, Indian or otherwise, should feel in the UK going about their business, or any damage that may be done to diplomatic privacies. That's entirely contrary to our commitments and obligations under the Vienna Convention. So I want to be absolutely clear about that. So there's, in that case, yes, there were protests from the sort of democratic context for protests. That's integral to democracies. You have protests here on the streets as well. Keeping that balance between the right to protest and making sure it doesn't cross the border into illegality is clearly the task of policing. That's a really difficult task to do. But the regret that we feel for any threat that an Indian diplomat felt is deep and heartfelt.
We're also speaking at a time when, as you mentioned, India is seeing large-scale protests against the Citizenship Amendment Act. We have seen the European Parliament, a resolution that has been placed before them, which is very critical of these CAA and India's handling of that. I just wanted to know the UK's position on that. Does the UK see it purely as an internal matter of India, or are you concerned about the consequences of the Citizenship Act combined with a national register for citizens too?
Look, Prime Minister Modi made quite clear that it was development for all, it was a trust of all, and it was together with all. Those are really important governance promises from the Prime Minister. So I am sure that the Indian government will be reassuring and looking at the concerns that some people have expressed here, very aware of it. I can't pick up a newspaper any day without seeing some reference to it, and obviously some of those have been picked up by the media abroad. So there is international media interest in that. I'm not going to get into the discussions that we have, as it were, in private with the government, but there is no question that the commitment from Prime Minister Modi downwards about working for the trust of all Indians is there in their election manifesto. And
that's what you hope that India will uphold?
Absolutely.
Okay, so there is some concern about the
No, this is an issue for the Indian government that they have to address, which is what governments deal with when they are confronted with challenges or protest all the world around.
Finally, High Commissioner, on the issue of terrorism, we just had an FATF Financial Action Task Force meeting last week and a big meeting that's coming up next month in February. There seems to be a sense that Pakistan is getting a bit of a breather on the issue of terror financing from that last meeting and may continue to remain on the grey list and eventually get off the grey list maybe later this year. Do you think that is the UK's feedback that they are actually doing something on that front, or is this just geopolitics that's playing out, which is why perhaps they're getting a breather?
We have been very clear with the Pakistani leadership about our perception of the requirement that rests with them to deal with a problem of terrorist groups that are operating in Pakistan. There's no doubt about that. We made that abundantly clear in the course of a recent conference here in the Raisina Dialogue. So that position remains very firm. Our assessment is the Pakistani leadership recognises the damage that is done to Pakistan. And for us, the most important thing, in a sense, to express to an Indian audience is the complete sympathy we have for the concerns that India will have about threats to it from terrorist groups wherever they operate.
But you think Pakistan is taking some steps finally, or
There are certainly indications that they are taking some steps. Are those sufficient? Not at the moment, but in terms of the direction of travel, our belief is that the leadership recognizes the damage that is being done to Pakistan and is trying to address those. As far as the Financial Action Task Force, that's a pretty technical set of issues, measurements and criteria that Pakistani actions will be measured against. There are a large number of measures in that, and they will be assessed. I'm not going to predict in any sense how that discussion will go.
All right. Well, High Commissioner, thank you very much for joining us, and good luck with your
Thank
next
you.
stint. Thank you.
Thanks very much.